Hi guys, this is Angela and welcome to my channel. I'm an artist who enjoys painting the world around me. All of my inspiration comes from everyday life and traveling. When I'm outside, I try to open my eyes and really observe the world around me. Everyone sees the world differently. There might be something that everyone else neglects, but only you can notice. So in this video, I'm going to show you my entire process of how I create these illustrations based on moments from life. In the past few years, as an attempt to really truly let myself enjoy the moment when I'm outside and not stress about drawing, I've developed a habit of taking reference photos. All of these reference photos were taken with the intention that I would draw them later. So I would take photos capturing the composition that I like, as well as details that I want to depict in my drawing. So in just a bit, I'll show you how exactly I take these reference photos outside, as well as how I organize them on my computer as an inspiration library. Then I'll create line art based on these photo reference, and I'll show you how I simplify my composition before I move on to coloring. I'll be voiceovering the entire process, so you'll be able to know what's going on in my mind creatively when I make each decision. So without further ado, let's get started. Step 1. After being home all day, I would go on a walk just to experience the real world and really feast my eyes on colors, shapes, and texture. If something catches my eye, I would stop and observe for a moment. I would really try to feel the lighting and its effect on me. I try to have a purpose in mind when I take reference photos. I take photos that capture the composition I want. I would also zoom in to take photos of details that I notice. Sometimes we forget that beauty is right around us. We don't have to travel far to see it. And walking in my neighborhood during golden hour reminds me of this. Step 2. For my new art book, I've been revisiting many old memories. I will go through all of my reference photos to see if something sparks my desire to draw. Sometimes I would pick out one composition and do a bigger illustration. And other times I would pick out 6 less complex compositions to form a page of storytelling. I rearrange them on my computer to see in what order I would want to recreate them. Since I plan on doing square illustrations, sometimes I would crop the reference photo just to give myself a better idea of what the composition would look like. Other times I would leave them uncropped. This way I can still see the interesting detail from outside the square composition. I can then decide what I want to include and what I want to leave out. If one photo isn't enough, I will use several photos to piece together one composition. I really try to not limit myself to these quick photos I've taken and try to rearrange the composition according to my own vision. Once I'm happy with the reference photos, I can move on to the next step. Step 3. Creating line art. I'm using a 14-point coated cardstock paper. I have a video on paper recommendation where I explain why it's the best for blending with acrylic markers. I'll be using an HB pencil to draw in the line work. It's dark enough for me to see and light enough to be covered by paint later on. I'll be using a really soft eraser which won't damage the coating on the paper. I'm creating this line art based on 6 photos I've chosen. Since it's probably hard for you to see what my line art actually looks like, I'll be recreating them digitally so I can explain my process. I've added the reference photo on the bottom left-hand corner so you can compare the reference to my drawing to see how I've simplified shapes and what I've decided to include and not include in my drawing. So when I start my line art, I try to focus on the biggest and most obvious shape in the composition. This way I can set the position of it first. I also want to focus on what I care about the most In this scene, I really like the foliage shadow on the building. So I'm going to simplify it and make sure I get it right on the building before I draw anything else. You'll notice that I didn't draw in any of the windows, I only drew the entrance, because the entrance is completely in shadow with no overlap of the dappled lighting. The windows, however, I will be selectively drawing them in later on when I'm painting. Then I'm drawing the bushes and plants in front of the building. In front of the bush, I'm adding in a utility pole. I think this vertical shape, as well as the wires, really adds interest to this composition. On the ground, I'm adding in a few indications of fallen leaves. For the second composition, what I really love is how golden the leaves of the trees are, as well as the shadow the building is casting on the tree. I'm starting with the biggest and most eye-catching tree because its placement in the composition is where the audience will naturally look at. You will notice that the building as well as trees on the left side are all vanishing towards one point, and the top of these vanishing shapes are pointing towards the tree that we want to look at. For the tree on the left side, I want to focus on the outline of the tree as well as the shadow shape. I'm indicating a little house in the distance. There's a lot of information for the tree on the left side, but I'm simplifying it to just the overall shape and branches within. I'm also indicating the cast shadow on the road because it creates a very interesting high contrast with the area of the road that's lit. Finishing the second composition with just a tiny bit more detail before moving on to the third composition. For the third composition, I'm starting with the foreground leaves. I find these scattered leaf shapes very interesting. I think the silhouette of them looks really great against the light background sky color. Then I'm moving on to setting the road, which also helps me set the horizon line. I'm indicating the mountain shape in the background because I really like how doesn't matter where I walk to in Vancouver, there's always a chance of me seeing mountain in the background. There's a lot going on the right side of the composition, but I'm just simplifying everything into big shapes with a little bit of indication of detail within. I really like these utility poles decreasing in size because not only do they add a vertical interest, but they also indicate the perspective, which gives this scene more depth. Same as the wires against the sky, they almost act as arrows pointing our eyes to the distant mountain. For the fourth composition, again I'm starting with the outline of the big shape. The circle with the light beam indicating the sun that's peeking through the tree. You can see some tree branches going in and out of the leaves, which is what I'm indicating. As for the bottom half, I'm not including the cars that's in this reference photo, because not only are they not the focus of this composition, they're also very distracting. I like the one house that's right behind these beautiful trees, and again I'm indicating a utility pole because I like the vertical element. So for the ground, I'm actually using another reference photo and indicating the light from the sun on the pavement. For the fifth composition, what I really like about this view is that we see the Grand Mountain behind the city of Vancouver. I want to go for a very flat and graphic style for the foreground houses, so you'll see that I'm just simplifying everything into almost geometric shapes. As for the trees, I'm creating individual shapes to make sure that they are the exact size I want and there's variation and different scale between them. There are also some foreground tree shapes. After finishing drawing everything in, I decided the foreground shape in the middle is a bit distracting, so I deleted it. For the final composition, I'm starting with the dark tree trunk in the foreground. After indicating the light that's peeking through, I'm going to focus on the shape of the foliage that's lit up by the lamp, because this is the area that caught my eye the most and I want to focus on depicting the most. I think knowing how to simplify foliage and complicated shapes really just comes with practice, and each person will develop their own shorthand for simplifying different elements. Adding in the ground and indicating some fallen leaves, as well as the apartment buildings in the background. Finally, just cleaning up the shapes, I decided to get rid of the foliage on the left side to leave some open space for the sky. With line art ready to go, now it's time to start coloring with acrylic markers. I have a really big selection of markers from the Molotow brand as well as from the Uni-posca brand. These ultra-thick PC7M markers are the newest addition to the family. Before I start each drawing, I always try to lay out all the markers I think I'll need neatly on the table according to their hue. You can see that I have several markers of the same color in different tip thickness. This variety gives me more flexibility when I draw. Sometimes I can get by with just 15 markers. Starting with the first composition, I'm using straw yellow for the side of the building that's slightly darker. For the building surface that's facing us, I'm using ivory, which is a very light yellow close to white. For the top of the building, I'm using a darker yellow, and using brown mixed in with purple for the edge of the building. I tend not to stick with just one color. I will often mix in a darker shade or a lighter shade to give it more interest. As for the sky, the area that's closer to the building is lighter in color, so I'm mixing in some white and then blending in light blue. I'm creating more contrast by brightening using ivory and darkening using bright yellow. As for the foliage shadow, I'm tracing its edge with skin pastel to give it a bit of warmth. You can see in the reference that even though the shadow itself is much cooler and darker, but the edge has a warm glow to it. For the shadow itself, I'm using lilac and light pink. For areas that I think look slightly warmer in the reference, I'm mixing in some beige. Now I'm working on the entrance doorway using purple, coral pink, bit of brown for the shadow, and some more light pink. Moving on to the utility pole. At the top, because it's lit up by the sun, I'm using straw yellow, and for area that's in shadow, I add in orange, pink, and purple. At the very top, to give it more contrast, I used brown and dark brown. The wires in the sky are very thin, which is very tricky to depict. I'm using a very thin yellow marker as well as extra fine tip white marker. A portion of the footage went missing here, but I'm working on the foliage or bushes and plants in the foreground, mostly using light green for the edge and green for the shadow. On the left side, I wanted to vary up the colors a bit, so I used blue, pastel green, and then for the shadow it's the same color. I'm just fixing up the shadow shape as well as the dapple lighting on the wall to make sure they don't look too repetitive. Moving on to the sidewalk, I'm sticking with cooler colors, pastel green. And for the pavement, instead of covering it with mostly gray, I decided to go for sky blue, which is much more saturated compared to the reference photo, but I think it creates more contrast with the yellow on the building wall. As I mentioned during my line art, I didn't indicate any of the windows on the building. So I'm now testing out window colors as well as how much of it I want to indicate and include by carefully testing out colors. Sometimes when it looks too dark or it doesn't look right, I can easily cover it up and correct it. That is one of the biggest advantage of using acrylic markers. You can easily overlay and make corrections. Finally, I'm using extra fine tip yellow marker to adding the fallen leaves on the foreground pavement. For the second composition, I quickly tested out the edge of the building on the right side and I started painting in the big tree. I'm trying my best to give the body of the tree some form and the implication of leaves. I'm mostly using yellow, orange, and as I move down, I'm changing to darker oranges as well as brown. It's a very stylistic approach that I've gotten used to using for drawing my trees, and I think everyone can approach it differently based on their own style. I'm using extra fine tip black and brown markers to indicate the tree branches going in and out of the foliage. I'm testing the sky color against the tree to see the type of contrast it will create. And I realized the edges of the tree that's touching the sky is either not dark enough or not light enough. After I've adjusted the contrast, I'm painting in the sky. In the reference photo, you can see that the bottom of the sky is lighter and slightly warmer. I'm blending in light blue with ivory. As you can tell, it's actually quite hard blending in a darker color with the lighter color smoothly in one area using acrylic markers. You'll see me often going back and forth trying to get the gradient right, which is why I would highly recommend using coated paper for doing these blending, because the coating will protect the paper and there will less likely be peeling. After I finish the sky, I'm fixing some of the detail on the bigger tree and then moving on to the row of trees on the left side. Mostly using the same colors as I used on the main tree, just yellow, orange, and brown. The reason why I chose 6 photos of Vancouver during the season of autumn is that it's just my favorite season to draw. There are so many vibrant colors, as you can see on these trees. They just create such great contrast to the color of the sky or the color of the shadow reflecting the sky. For the trees on the left side, I'm mostly paying attention to how to make each of them read well against each other, as well as what color to use for the background that's against these trees. Coming back to the one that's in the front, I'm adding in a lot more detail and using the extra fine tip white marker, adding in some of the gaps between the foliage where we can see the background or the sky color. For the huge tree on the left side close to the edge with not many leaves left on its branches, I went with a very stylistic approach that I've kind of developed in the past few months painting these small square illustrations. So everyone will have their own approach, and this is just what I find most appealing and works for my style of illustration. The extra fine tip markers do come in really handy when drawing trees. They're great for indicating tree branches and the trunk. Testing out the color of the house in the background and then moving on to the pavement or the street color. I'm using beige and a bit of ivory because the area that's not in shadow does look pretty bright and I want to create a lot of contrast with the cast shadow color. For the sidewalk, I'm using blue and a very cool gray, and for the cast shadow, I'm using sky blue. which is also the streak color I used for the first composition. I just really like the contrast sky blue creates against ivory as well as orange. Because the cast shadow usually reflects the color of the sky, and my sky is a pretty vibrant light blue, so it doesn't feel very strange when I use a more saturated blue for the cast shadow. If the sky was more desaturated, then the cast shadow would be more desaturated as well. So I worked on the buildings last because they just weren't that important in this composition. I think I usually work in the order of priority, whatever I think is more important first, and always leaving highlights and details last. For the third composition, I started with the distant background elements because I wanted to test out how light they can be. I can then be sure of how dark certain other areas can go. So just using yellow, bright yellow, and orange for the trees on the right side. If you just squint and look at the right side of the reference photo, it's really complicated and there's a lot of things going on. So my aim when I'm recreating it as an illustration is to break up these shapes and make sure that each shape reads well as having contrast against the object next to it. I'm not too concerned with matching the exact colors in the reference photo because I'm more thinking about how to use colors that look harmonious next to each other and be conscious to put a darker value against a lighter value. So after working out most of the shapes on the right side, I decided to test out the grassy road on the left side, and the little tree behind consists of the same colors as the ones on the right side. So moving on to the pavement, as you can see in the photo, it's a warm reddish gray color. It's not completely desaturated, so I wouldn't go for an actual gray marker, which is why I chose to use lilac pastel, because I think by replacing grays with a pastel color, it really adds vibrance and appeal to my illustration. As I move upwards, I'm blending in beige and light pink with the lilac pastel. And I thought the lilac pastel looked a bit too simple or too flat, so I added in some streaks of light blue. This will also create some texture on the road. So now there are 3 areas left in this composition: the left side foreground tree, right side foreground tree, and the sky. Before working on the sky, I could set the darkness of the right-hand tree first. So that's what I'm doing by testing out how much orange or how much darker I should go for this tree. Since I didn't use any brown or any dark shade, and the orange is kind of just a mid-tone, I want to make sure the sky is light enough that can create contrast with the background mountain as well as these orange trees. I'm just using the white marker with some light blue paint residue on its tip and using that to my advantage, creating the light blue color in the sky. Moving upwards, I'm blending in more light blue, so there's somewhat of a gradient. Filling in some shapes and gaps that's forgotten before I move on to the foreground tree on the left side. Because this is the topmost layer, there's a lot of things underneath it, for example the sky and possibly a tree behind it. I'm leaving it last. This way I can clearly define the shapes and the edges won't be blurry. Finally, I carefully chose the position to add in the utility pole. In the reference photo as well as my line work, there were one more, but I decided to just do one and not overcomplicate the composition. For the fourth composition, I'm working on this huge area of foliage. There are gaps in the foliage where we see area of the sky. I try to lay down a layer of yellow before I put in the green of the foliage. This way it would seem like the sky or the gaps in the tree are glowing. Moving towards the left side, in the reference photo you can see that the colors shifted a tiny bit from a warm green to a cooler green. Mixing in some sky blue because it creates a really nice contrast against the yellow. I try to use the white of the paper as the lightest light, circling the two round gaps where the sun is peeking through by using a light yellow. I try to be intentional with the direction of my brush strokes, even though I'm not really using brushes. By giving these strokes a certain direction, it will give the foliage a sense of movement. So just continuing to work on the glow or the sun peeking through the trees, and adding in some more dotted highlights as gaps within the foliage. The foliage is mostly finished. I'm putting in the violet blue of the roof of the house right behind it to just check if there's enough contrast between the yellow and the roof. When I'm choosing these simple compositions within my neighborhood, I really like it when I can see a house peeking through trees because I think the geometric quality of the house as well as the straight angles and the flat shapes creates a really nice contrast against the more rounded and more organic forms of nature. The foliage is definitely what I cared about the most in this drawing. For the rest of it, I'm just filling in shapes that, like I said before, creates great contrast against each other, and the colors are somewhat in harmony with the overall illustration. I decided to not include any cars in the foreground because not only would the complicated shapes and the extra colors of the cars distract us from what I really wanted to convey, which is the background foliage, it will also make it very hard to see what's going on behind it. My intention with these small illustrations is to keep everything as simple as I can, colorful and easy to read. Instead of the cars, I've chosen to illustrate light and shadow on the road. This way it will actually reinforce the light source that we see, as well as providing these directional light shape pointing inwards. And so just adding in some more final detail here and there, as well as indicating the tree trunk and branches, because otherwise the foliage would just be floating in the sky. For the next illustration, I first used beige to outline the edge of the mountain, before using light blue and mixing in a little bit of sky blue at the edge of the background mountain. In the reference photo, the mountains aren't that blue, but I really wanted to exaggerate the color so it can contrast with the mid-ground houses. What's interesting about this reference photo is there's one tree that's really big and really stands out. But unlike the second composition where I actually wanted to focus on a big tree, I decided to shrink it down and just blend it in with the rest of the mid-ground elements. Because if you really look at it, that tree isn't that interesting. It's not lit up, it doesn't have a really interesting form, and I would rather focus on the house to the left of it than make that tree extra eye-catching. So working on these trees individually to create great contrast between each of them, and then moving on to that house that I just mentioned. I really like how there's a bit of dark orange and brown and just all the colors that are echoing throughout these illustrations. So I'm just filling in color blocks that are varying in lightness and in color. It's actually quite fun when I come across a composition like this. It's almost just like a coloring book. I don't know if you can see in the reference photo, but of course real houses have complicated window shapes. But for these small illustrations, I've realized using dots to indicate the windows actually work a lot better than spending time creating realistic windows. For the grass, I finally used the PC7M acrylic marker, and it's really convenient when I have a big marker like this to cover a big area without having streaks or showing the white of the paper. I decided to adding some grass blades with a darker green so the grass itself doesn't look that flat, and there's a bit of change in value when it's closer to the bottom of the composition. So just finishing up the mid-ground before adding in some yellow to the grass and finally working on the sky. In the reference photo, even though you do feel like this is close to sunset, there's a bit of warmth in the sky, but it's mostly gray or pinkish gray. I wanted to exaggerate that, which is why I used light orange, ivory, and beige. Even though it's a lot more saturated than my reference photo, but that's the magic of creating an illustration. You can make these worlds as colorful as you want. So at last, we arrived at the final composition. This video is actually very long, probably one of my longest video. I hope it's been helpful so far. For the 6 reference photos, I wanted to choose at least one that is nightscape, so I can offer a bit more variety in this page of illustration. What I love the most when I go on these night walks is when I see foliage being lit up by the lamp. When there's a really strong and prominent light source, I always try to lay down the lightest color around it first. And then working on the 2 tree branches right beside it, I'm making sure to use lighter orange and brown when it's close to the light source and eventually gets darkened into dark brown and black. So I'm just jotting down the general foliage shape before I refine it even more. And for area that isn't lit by the light source, it's a lot darker, so I used brown and khaki green and black. I want to make sure the edges of these leaves really stand out, so I'm carefully refining the edge by using a brown marker to almost mask out the really light yellow leaf shapes. Using emerald green, I added in a bit of the sky, and then after fixing some detail, I'm going to carefully fill in the sky color, making sure that I don't cover up any of the leaf shapes that I already indicated. It was actually quite tricky picking a sky color. I wanted it to be dark enough just like the reference photo, but at the same time, the sky color needs to have contrast against the brown as well as the yellow. If I used sky blue, then it would be too close in value to the brown, therefore I decided to use light blue. Now just working on defining more detail within the foliage and making sure there's some sky color peeking through. Moving downwards, working on the apartment buildings in the background. I wanted the edge to be dark and therefore create a really strong silhouette against the sky. For the building itself, I blended in some purple as well as some slate gray and emerald gray, depending on how light I want it to be. Even though the apartment buildings are just in the background and not what I really cared about depicting, but because the foliage is actually pointing downwards and leading our eyes to these apartment buildings, I wanted to make sure the details, for example the door and the windows, they still made sense, but at the same time, I didn't want the windows to be too distracting. Continuing downwards, I'm painting in the sidewalk as well as some fallen leaves scattered on it. It's a bit hard to see in the reference photo because it's blocked by the cars as well as the foreground fence, but there are a lot of beautiful fallen leaves on the sidewalk. What's great about working with reference photo that you took yourself is that you actually remember a lot of the details that one photo can't capture. So just fixing the leaf shapes a bit more to make sure that they are very distinct and they read well against the sky as well as the apartment building. And finally, I thought the second tree branch was a little bit too parallel and too similar to the thicker one. I decided to alter it just a tiny bit so it's less repetitive. Finally adding in some dark leaves and then deciding that I didn't really like them, so I got rid of some of them. Sometimes I would try something out. If I don't like it, I can always cover it up. And that's it for these 6 illustrations based on the neighborhood I lived in when I was in Vancouver. I think this is such a great way to record a place that's meaningful to you. So I really hope you were able to learn or be inspired by my creative process, and you can start turning the world around you into your style of illustration. If you liked everything I've shown and you want to support my art, I have a Kickstarter that I will link in the description box. You will be able to get prints, postcards, coasters, printed line art, as well as my original paintings. So check it out if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in my next video.